Weaponized beauty. 14 Hollywood goddesses who played by their own rules. What earth-shattering secrets did the elite painstakingly bury behind the dazzling velvet curtains and flawless smiles of Hollywood's golden age? Don't be fooled by the elegant silk gowns or the glittering diamonds. Hidden beneath the goddess-like beauty of these legendary screen icons was a fierce underworld teeming with forbidden affairs, betrayals, and dark secrets, capable of shaking the very foundations of power. These women were far from obedient starlets. There was a violet-eyed queen who collected husbands like trophies, a brilliant European inventor whose mind was even sharper than her curves, and a blonde bombshell whose whispered secrets stained the Oval Office itself. These 14 beauties tore up every rulebook, weaponizing their stunning looks to bring the world's most powerful men to their knees, boldly defying blackmail and social ruin. To uncover the raw, untold truth about the 14 most seductive and dangerous sirens in cinematic history, make sure to subscribe to the archive today. Countless breathtaking mysteries are waiting for you to discover. Marilyn Monroe. She was the ultimate undisputed blonde bombshell of the 20th century, a woman whose breathtaking curves and breathy voice entirely defined a massive era of American cinema. Born Norma Jean Mortensen, she completely transformed herself into a multi-million-dollar studio fantasy, radiating a blinding luminosity that made presidents, legendary playwrights, and sports icons weak in the seas. However, the glittering facade of diamonds and silk hid a profoundly brilliant, deeply misunderstood artist who was entirely trapped by her own devastating allure. While studio executives desperately tried to market her as a mindless, easily controllable sex symbol, she fiercely rebelled, frequently walking off sets and famously demanding serious, dramatic roles. Her romantic life was an absolute, highly publicized whirlwind of catastrophic heartbreak. She married baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, who aggressively tried to suffocate her career to keep her as a traditional housewife, and intellectual titan Arthur Miller, who ultimately failed to understand her deeply complex trauma. Her most explosive, highly guarded secrets involved rumored, dangerous liaisons with the highest levels of political power, most notably culminating in her infamous, breathy rendition of Happy Birthday to the President of the United States. She wasn't simply a tragic victim of love. She was a woman desperately searching affection in an industry catastrophe that wanted to relentlessly consume her. When she tragically died alone at just 36, the Hollywood machine immediately tried to bury her as a cautionary tale of reckless excess. Yet, decades later, her legacy completely eclipses the men who tried to control her, cementing her not just as a global sex symbol, but as a fiercely resilient, immortal icon who continues to mesmerizingly haunt the world. Elizabeth Taylor. With her incredibly rare, striking violet eyes and a magnetic presence that commanded absolute obedience, she was the undisputed, reigning queen of Hollywood royalty. She completely rejected the studio system's demand for demure, obedient starlets, choosing instead to crash through life and love like a beautifully destructive hurricane. By the remarkably young age of 26, she had already buried a beloved husband, stolen another from America's reigning sweetheart, and completely shattered industry records by demanding an unprecedented $1 million salary for a single cinematic role. However, it was her catastrophically passionate, completely explosive entanglement with Richard Burton on the highly chaotic set, Cleopatra, that fundamentally rewrote the modern rules of celebrity scandal. Their affair was so intensely public and heavily destructive that the Vatican itself aggressively condemned her for erotic vagrancy. They engaged in legendary, screaming brawls on massive luxury yachts, hurling crystal ashtrays and trading vicious insults, only to fiercely reconcile behind heavy closed doors. She collected a staggering 8 marriages throughout her turbulent lifetime, openly scoffing at the hypocritical moral standards of the era. She famously declared that she only slept with men she was married to, completely weaponizing matrimony as her ultimate shield. Every single divorce left a highly public bruise, heavily documented by a relentless, ravenous paparazzi culture that she essentially helped create. Despite immense personal tragedies, severe health struggles, and heavy reliance on coping mechanisms, she never once apologized for her massive, unquenchable appetite for life. She wasn't just surviving the crushing pressures of global fame. She was actively, aggressively thriving in the absolute center of the inferno, building an immortal legacy draped in breathtaking diamonds and utterly unapologetic desire. Joan Crawford. She was the ultimate, terrifying embodiment of sheer, unadulterated willpower, a woman who literally clawed her way out of absolute poverty to completely dominate the golden age of MGM. With her severely sculpted eyebrows, famously exaggerated shoulder pads, and a stare cold enough to instantly freeze a room, she constructed an impenetrable armor against an industry designed to readily discard women. She possessed a ravenous, highly calculating hunger for absolute stardom, aggressively outworking, outsmarting, and completely outlasting every single one of her rivals. Her romantic conquests were an impressive, highly strategic roll call of powerful leading men, top-tier directors, and massive studio executives. She famously married the brilliant actor Franco Tone, completely dominating the relationship in her relentless, highly aggressive pursuit of an Academy Award. When he ultimately left her, she reportedly dismissed the massive heartbreak by coldly stating she could finally get back to work. She was entirely obsessed with maintaining absolute control, famously bathing in freezing ice water to aggressively preserve her youth and running her massive estate with the terrifying precision of a military general. When the studio system inevitably attempted to push her aside as she aged, she completely reinvented herself, delivering a horrifyingly brilliant, career-reviving performance in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Her legacy remains completely shrouded in intense, highly debated controversy, fueled by vicious rumors of brutal backstage rivalries and deeply complex family dynamics. Yet, even her most aggressive detractors could never deny her staggering, breathtaking talent. She was an absolute force of nature who completely refused to fade into obscurity, utilizing her razor-sharp ambition to carve a permanent, indelible mark into the very foundation of cinematic history. Hedy Lamarr. She was aggressively marketed to the absolute masses as the most exquisitely beautiful woman in the world, an exotic, deeply mysterious Austrian import who made Hollywood censors sweat with her groundbreaking, highly controversial European film debuts. With cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and an incredibly hypnotic, smoldering presence, she was entirely cast as the ultimate, brainless screen siren. However, the most catastrophic, highly guarded secret she possessed wasn't a scandalous affair. It was her absolute, terrifyingly brilliant genius. Behind the glamorous Las Velvet ropes and highly publicized 6 marriages to massive arms dealers and powerful tycoons, she possessed a mind that literally changed the course of modern human history. While the world was entirely distracted by her flawless face, she spent her nights sitting at a drafting table, aggressively co-inventing a highly complex, frequency-hopping radio guidance system designed entirely to defeat the Nazis during World War II. Her incredibly advanced, brilliant technology fundamentally laid the absolute groundwork for the modern invention of Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth. Tragically, the heavily patriarchal, deeply sexist military and studio establishment completely refused to take a glamorous actress seriously, aggressively telling her to simply sell the war bonds with her face instead of fighting with her spectacular brain. She spent her entire life completely trapped inside the suffocating cage of her own breathtaking beauty, deeply frustrated by a society that only valued her aesthetic appeal. In her highly isolated later years, completely abandoned by the industry she helped build, she reportedly resorted to bizarre shoplifting incidents simply to feel a thrill of rebellion. She was the ultimate tragic paradox, an absolute intellectual titan forced to play a beautiful fool, whose brilliant mind completely outlasted every single one of her famous lovers. Mae West. Long before the restrictive, heavily puritanical Hays Code attempted to completely sanitize the silver screen, she was the undisputed, aggressively unapologetic queen of absolute sexual liberation. She didn't just portray brilliant, highly seductive women on camera. She entirely wrote, produced, and aggressively controlled every single aspect of her massive theatrical empire. In a deeply conservative 1930s America, she completely shocked the nation by walking out of a jail cell after being arrested for obscenity, heavily weaponizing the massive scandal to instantly catapult herself into global superstardom. She possessed an incredibly sharp, completely lethal wit, delivering iconic, heavily loaded double entendres with a confident, mesmerizing swagger that left powerful men completely helpless. She completely inverted the traditional power dynamics of Hollywood, refusing to ever play the victim or the submissive love interest. Instead, she fiercely commanded the screen, famously keeping a highly publicized, rotating angel of significantly younger, incredibly muscular male companions. She fiercely protected her absolute independence, entirely refusing to submit to the restrictive bonds of traditional marriage, famously quipping that she simply wasn't ready for an institution. While major studio executives were absolutely terrified of her immense, unfiltered power, she systematically became the highest-paid woman in the entire United States, completely saving Paramount Pictures from total bankruptcies during the depths of the Great Depression. She maintained absolute, ironclad control over her image, entirely refusing to drink, smoke, or compromise her fierce autonomy. By the time she passed away in her late 80s, she had completely outlived her fiercest critics, cementing a massive, untouchable legacy as the original, fearless architect of female empowerment who entirely rewrote the rules of modern entertainment. Ava Gardner. She possessed a face that was literally sculpted for pure sin and a deeply intoxicating, earthy laugh that could effortlessly bring the hardest, most powerful men to their absolute knees. Born into severe poverty in rural North Carolina, she completely conquered the globe with an incredibly fierce, untamable energy that absolutely refuses to be heavily managed by studio fixers. She famously showed up to a highly exclusive Spanish royal palace, completely barefoot and incredibly hungover, prompting the king to send her champagne anyway. She didn't just chase romance. She completely collided with it, leaving a massive, highly publicized trail of shattered marriages and broken contracts in her wake. While she engaged in highly passionate flings with billionaires, legendary bullfighters, and powerful dukes, her entire existence was fundamentally defined by her completely chaotic, overwhelmingly explosive marriage to Frank Sinatra. Their heavily publicized romance was a massive, violent thunderstorm of public screaming matches, terrifyingly dramatic threats of self-harm, and deeply intoxicating passion. When she ultimately demanded a divorce, the legendary crooner was so completely devastated, he allegedly attempted to take his own life. The studio absolutely scrambled to aggressively clean up her massive European messes, but she entirely refused to be tamed, openly admitting that she felt completely lost without the intense chaos of a romantic entanglement. In her later years, she heavily retreated to London, fiercely guarding her privacy, as the exhaust toll of her incredibly fast-paced, heavy drinking lifestyle began to catch up with her. She was the ultimate deeply tragic cinematic siren, a woman who loved far too fiercely, drank far too deeply, and absolutely refused to ever apologize for completely burning her own world to the ground. Jean Harlow. She was the absolute original, deeply mesmerizing platinum blonde, a woman whose shockingly white hair and incredibly slinky, silk-draped curves completely ignited the early 1930s box office. She possessed a highly captivating, entirely raw sexual magnetism combined with a deeply endearing, brilliant comedic timing that made her an instant, massive global sensation. However, Her incredibly rapid meteoric ascent was heavily shadowed by an absolutely terrifying, profoundly dark string of deeply horrific personal tragedies. Her first marriage ended incredibly abruptly, but it was the highly suspicious, deeply terrifying death of her second husband, powerful MGM executive Paul Byrne, that completely solidified her scandalous legend. Just 2 months into their highly publicized marriage, he was found dead in their home under incredibly mysterious circumstances. The ruthless studio machine aggressively scrambled to completely scrub the crime scene, heavily forcibly grieving Harlow back onto the set mere days later. To aggressively capitalize on the massive tabloid frenzy, she completely survived the horrific scandal, engaging in highly passionate, deeply complex romances with powerful leading men like William Powell. But her grueling, intensely demanding work schedule was actively destroying her physical health. At the incredibly tragic, devastatingly young age of 26, her completely exhausted body entirely failed her. She violently collapsed on the set of her final film, succumbing to severe, entirely untreated kidney failure. She wasn't just a glamorous, highly profitable commodity. She was a deeply vulnerable, incredibly hard-working young woman, entirely consumed by the massive, unforgiving gears of the Hollywood machine. Her shocking, premature death cemented her absolute immortality, leaving behind a highly influential, deeply tragic legacy that forever defined the brutal cost of being the industry's ultimate fantasy. Lana Turner. She was heavily marketed as the ultimate, flawless sweetheart girl, possessing a deeply sultry voice and an incredibly polished, pristine image that completely defined post-war American glamour. However, behind the heavily curated, pristine studio facade, she possessed a massive, deeply destructive attraction to highly dangerous men. She aggressively collected an astounding 7 marriages and was heavily linked to a highly volatile mix of powerful actors, wealthy moguls, and deeply terrifying underworld figures. Her incredibly chaotic personal life violently exploded into one of the most horrific, absolute blood-chilling scandals in the entire history of Los Angeles. In 1958, her highly aggressive, deeply possessive mafia enforcer boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, was found brutally stabbed to death on the floor of her luxurious Beverly Hills mansion. In a highly dramatic, totally surreal courtroom spectacle, her 14-year-old daughter ultimately took the blame, claiming she violently attacked the gangster to fiercely protect her mother. While the highly sensationalized ruling was officially deemed justifiable homicide, massive persistent rumors heavily suggested a much darker, completely orchestrated studio cover-up. Instead of completely retreating in absolute disgrace, she aggressively leaned into the massive notoriety. She delivered an incredibly raw, completely devastating, Oscar-nominated performance in Imitation of Life, entirely channeling her own horrific trauma to generate astronomical box office returns. She was the absolute master of survival, fiercely refusing to be completely defined or destroyed by the massive violence that constantly surrounded her. She continued to act, love, and live completely on her own terms, proving that a true Hollywood goddess doesn't run from a massive scandal. She actively, brilliantly weaponizes it to completely secure her own cinematic immortality. Zsa Gabor. She was the absolute, undisputed pioneer of being incredibly famous, entirely for being famous, heavily laying the absolute groundwork for the modern reality television era, bursting onto the highly conservative Hollywood scene with an incredibly thick, heavily exaggerated Hungarian accent and a massive, completely unquenchable thirst for highly expensive diamonds. She completely bypassed traditional acting routes to become an absolute cultural phenomenon. She possessed a razor-sharp, incredibly brilliant wit, constantly delivering highly quotable, deeply cynical one-liners about her massive collection of wealthy ex-husbands. She aggressively married an astounding 9 times, effortlessly securing highly lucrative alimony settlements from powerful hotel magnates, wealthy oil tycoons, and heavily connected diplomats. She absolutely understood the highly transactional nature of Hollywood fame, completely refusing to play the quiet, obedient starlet. Instead, she aggressively courted massive tabloid controversy, turning her highly volatile, deeply chaotic personal life into a highly profitable, incredibly entertaining public spectacle. She famously made massive global headlines by aggressively slapping a heavily armed Beverly Hills police officer during a completely chaotic traffic stop, defiantly showing up to court draped in absolutely staggering amounts of high-end jewelry. She completely recognized that the industry aggressively punished independent women, so she entirely leaned into absolute, unapologetic excess, heavily weaponizing her glamorous femininity to completely dominate the press cycle. She lived an incredibly long, massively lavish life, fiercely maintaining her heavily curated, highly glamorous facade until her fearful breath. At the age of 99, she completely outsmarted an entire industry, absolutely proving that pure, unadulterated audacity and a massive diamond collection are far more powerful than any standard acting award. Clara Bow. She was the incredibly vibrant, deeply electric embodiment of the massive roaring 20s, completely defining the entire era as the absolute, undisputed original it girl. With her highly expressive, widely heavily mascaraed eyes and her famously messy, bobbed red curls, she possessed an incredibly raw, highly kinetic energy that completely revolutionized the silent film industry. She wasn't just acting. She was heavily vibrating with absolute undeniable life, effortlessly commanding astronomical box office returns in massive hits, like Wings. However, her incredibly impoverished, deeply traumatic childhood left her with massive, completely unhealed psychological scars that heavily clashed with the intense, highly sanitized demands of global superstardom. The highly aggressive, deeply ruthless studio bosses heavily exploited her massive sex appeal, while completely turning a blind eye to her intensely erratic, highly vulnerable mental state. Her massive, completely devastating downfall was heavily orchestrated by a highly bitter former assistant who aggressively leaked a deeply scandalous, incredibly explicit diary detailing her highly active, immensely controversial romantic escapades. The deeply conservative, highly judgmental public viciously turned on her, completely branding her as deeply unstable and dangerously promiscuous. The deeply hypocritical Hollywood establishment, entirely terrified of the massive PR nightmare, aggressively distanced themselves, quietly pushing their biggest star into absolute terrifying obscurity. Completely exhausted by the massive betrayal and heavily battling severe, deeply crippling psychiatric issues, she permanently retreated to a highly isolated ranch, completely disappearing from the massive spotlight she once entirely dominated. Her highly tragic, incredibly fast-paced life serves as a brutal, deeply terrifying lesson in how aggressively the industry will completely consume and discard serious brilliant artists the very second they stop being highly profitable. Dolores Del Rio. She arrived in the highly cutthroat, heavily segregated environment of 1920s Los Angeles, entirely draped in absolute mystery, completely defying the intensely racist, heavily stereotypical casting conventions of the era. Possessing an incredibly pristine, absolutely flawless, aristocratic beauty and a deeply captivating, highly refined presence, she completely refused to be heavily relegated to highly offensive secondary roles. She commanded the silver screen as a massive, deeply powerful leading lady, effortlessly captivating audiences with a highly sophisticated, deeply enigmatic allure. She possessed an incredible, absolute emotional intelligence, fiercely maintaining total control over her highly publicized, deeply passionate romantic entanglements. Her most highly infamous, heavily debated relationship was with the absolute boy genius of cinema, Orson Welles, who was significantly younger than her. Their highly intense, deeply intellectual affair completely captivated the massive gossip columnists. But when he inevitably proved deeply unfaithful, she didn't aggressively completely unravel. she completely walked away with absolute, unshakable dignity. She famously maintained a highly secret, completely hidden apartment in Los Angeles, heavily utilizing the entirely private space to entirely conduct her personal affairs completely far away from the prying, ravenous eyes of the studio fixers. When the deeply ageist, highly restrictive Hollywood system inevitably began to heavily sideline her in favor of much younger talent, she executed a brilliant, absolutely massive career pivot. She aggressively returned to Mexico, entirely reinventing herself as the absolute foundational pillar of the golden age of Mexican cinema, delivering the most deeply profound, highly acclaimed performances of her entire career. She completely proved that true, absolute royalty cannot be heavily discarded by a terrified studio system. Gloria Graham. She was the absolute undisputed bad girl of the entire film noir genre, completely weaponizing a deeply smoky voice and an incredibly wounded, highly seductive stare to entirely dominate the post-war box office. She heavily possessed a deeply unique, highly asymmetrical beauty that completely captivated audiences, frequently playing incredibly complex, highly dangerous women who effortlessly destroyed the powerful men around them. She completely achieved absolute critical immortality by winning an Academy Award for a remarkably brief, highly intense performance. But her massive, deeply terrifying off-screen life completely eclipsed her brilliant on-screen legacy. She engaged in a highly volatile, completely destructive marriage with the massive, visionary director Nicholas Ray, which completely imploded in the most incredibly horrific, absolutely unimaginable scandal in Hollywood history. He reportedly caught her entirely with his own 13-year-old son, her own highly young stepson. The deeply horrifying, incredibly explicit revelation completely sent massive shockwaves through the entire deeply terrified industry. Decades later, she shockingly completely married the young man, entirely solidifying her deeply controversial, heavily toxic reputation. The massive, deeply judgmental studios completely froze her out, heavily terrified of the absolutely devastating PR nightmare. She deeply struggled with massive, heavily crippling insecurities regarding her highly unique physical appearance, heavily fearing she was entirely losing her absolute allure. She completely retreated to the highly grueling, deeply demanding world of theater, fiercely continuing to act even as her physical health completely failed her. She ultimately collapsed entirely mid-performance, completely refusing to ever stop working until her final, highly tragic breath, completely cementing her absolute legacy as a fiercely brilliant, deeply broken artist completely consumed by her own massive chaos.